customer that absolutely, without a doubt, we're going to commit that much scope for you. We would tell the team, this is what I think you can do. Usually we end up somewhere in the middle. You know, if you set a goal here, a team typically ends up here. I told my customer we're here. Now, this is my secret, John. I said we'd get here, and we typically delivered in the middle, right? Because people are a little optimistic in their estimates, and they typically under-deliver a bit. But I couldn't under-deliver to my customer. So we set this approach of consistently under-promising and over-delivering. And that made our customer happy, made our stakeholders happy. Our team, we had to still push to be productive. It wasn't easy, because we can't let our team just go, okay, we're going to lower our focus and be really inefficient, because this is the real world. John could go find another supplier for software development. So we needed to be efficient. So we would use our focus factor to forecast how we would do in different situations. Now, as I walk through the life here, so we did a fix and polish. Then you see, man, it just dropped right in the toilet there. Why was that? Big stories, complex new features. It was a difficult sprint. I remember that sprint very clearly. We had a lot of agony. The nice thing is people were committed. They worked the overtime to get the scope done. But what we learned, because we collect the timesheet actuals, we learned from that, wait a minute, our focus dropped. So we need to consider that situation and don't predict such a good focus factor for a sprint like that. That way we can get the overtime down, because you don't want to turn into a sweatshop, right? Where you're just pushing people too hard. You burn out people, you lose the key knowledge and skills. So by tracking that, you can manage that and focus your team and give them a good target that's achievable. So then after we did real complex features, well, a little tuning cycle, right? We did complex features, so they're not quite right. As we all know, we give the software to our customer and they say, yeah, that's what I asked for, but it's not quite what I wanted. And so we do a little tune cycle. Then we had a lot more scope to deal with. We had to get a lot more work done. So our team grew. As you saw from that chart, we went from about 12 people to about 27 people over a 2-month period. It's a big growth. Our productivity went down, as you might expect. Using this, you can do a better forecast, is the real point. This is not a graph that just shows we were good, we were bad. It shows the life cycle and the situation your team is in. And you can use that situational knowledge to forecast better. And that's why focus is so much better than velocity for forecasting. And finally, toward the end of this summer, our big team got up to speed. You'll notice a bigger team is still a little less productive than a smaller team, but our velocity was higher. So we got a lot more done at slightly less efficient pace, you might say. Does that make sense? All right, so on to the scope backlog. So think of the backlog, a big bucket of scope. We use the target process tool. I'm not selling the tool, by the way, but it works well, and we use it. We define stories or features, whatever terminology you like, and we have a big backlog. And user stories, they're an interpretation of requirements, okay? And one of the rules of thumb we came up with, stories can't be more than 40 hours. We found I don't know the reason, but I can guess, if it got bigger than 40 hours, it always overran hugely. If it was less than 40 hours, we'd be in the plus or minus 10% range, which was good. So we strive to always have stories less than 40 hours in the initial estimate. I would suggest if they're bigger than 40 that you probably don't understand them well enough, you haven't mapped out the complexity yet, and that's why they grow. And we, through our process of ongoing review and harnessing the change, we would be reviewing those stories with our customer every sprint. We would forecast a set of stories to say, okay, those are the ones I think we want to accomplish in the next sprint. We would work with our customer to refine them, make sure we understood them, and we put our assumptions in there, saying this is what I think our estimate is about, because quite often we got back to the story to build it, and when we started detailed planning, we realized through discussion with our customer that maybe some of our assumptions weren't good, and therefore the estimates changed. Sometimes it got smaller, more often than not it got bigger. But because we had a good agreement with our customer, and a customer who negotiated in good faith with us, we were able to resolve that. But you have to do that in advance of building it. You can't come to the customer after the build and say, by the way, it costs you twice as much. Right? That's, you know, if I bring my car into the mechanic, this is not a good story. He says it's $200, I show up at the end of the day and it's $500. Not a good story. You got to work with your customer. Yes, sir?
Sorry, I was wondering, the story negotiation, at what point is it happening? You mentioned that 4 weeks in advance, 2 weeks in advance, and 1 week in advance, the scope definition improves. At what point in time you do the negotiation?
Well, at several levels. A good question. We first negotiated a scope baseline to cover roughly 9 months. At that point, we had 1 or 2 sentences that defined the feature. Okay, because there was, where were we, 318 stories when we kicked off this round. So they were, some of them were 1 or 2 sentences. Some of them were a bit bigger because we had historically known that feature. So it started way in advance, to answer your question, and then we iteratively worked them down further, okay? Down to the point where they were now testable. The story is complete in our world when you have test cases that a developer can test against, typically automated.
So at that level, you can only produce order of magnitude estimates with stories?
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that baseline is likely to be refined by you learning what actually needs to be delivered.
Yes, right? We had the luxury of a group of people who had been involved in this domain for a while, so they could do good. The estimates we found, because we did a calibration exercise, the estimates were consistent, and that's all that mattered, that they were consistent, right? And we had about 3 months of focus factor history before we committed to the bigger baseline. So, well, you see how that ties together, right?
Right, so you had like a trial.
Exactly.
And then you
Exactly.
kind of calibrate your velocity and be able to estimate.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, as I was saying, a set of stories is agreed and tagged as a starting baseline. It's not your complete backlog. It's a set of features that your customer sees value in against their roadmap for the next 6 months, year, 2 years. 2 years is probably a bit too far out. I would say 6 months to a year is about the right time frame. So how do we manage the change? Well, we all understand what diffs are, and that's essentially what we did. We built a little tracking tool. It compares 2 versions of a baseline, and thus freed our requirements team from the need to track their own changes. This was the biggest benefit I found from this tool. Because what would happen is we would have our system engineers, our BA group, if you will, working requirements, changing estimates, working with our architect, and all of a sudden the scope we thought we could do was twice as big, and we couldn't figure out, well, what happened? And sure, our BAs were very disciplined, and they tried to track all the changes, but once our team started to grow, it was too much complexity. So we implemented a very, very simple tool, okay? And they could just go work in the tool. We could extract the new baseline, do a diff, understand what changed, have a discussion about it. And we knew it wouldn't miss anything. And we had sort of ground rules with our customer that, look, you asked us to deliver 318 stories. It worked out to 5,000 hours, I believe, at initial estimate. And if that starts to change, we need to manage it. We had commitment to keep it within that envelope. And that was important because nobody can deliver if the scope just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And this was a way to manage that. And we had a formal configuration control board that reviewed this stuff. It was typically a 1-hour teleconference once a week, once every 2 weeks, where the business analyst team would say, this is what I did, here are the differences, let's talk about it, do we buy into that? That was a really important way that we could keep in constant communication with our customer to communicate the change, because quite often, John here, he has a group of product people, and they're doing their thing. So he's not involved with every little thing they're doing. He needed to see it at the high level to say, okay guys, where are we this week? Did the scope grow? Did it shrink? What features do we think we need now? And John could make good decisions based on a very high level information, like, oh yeah, I know that customer's, oh, they're about to sign, so those features are more important. So here's a couple of views of this tracker. Really simple tool, little thing built in Access, okay? So here it's highlighting that this story, which is about adjuster creating, editing, and delete claim receipts, grew from 40 to 80. So that's a good discussion point. Well, what changed? Why did it get bigger? Who made it bigger? Was there assumptions? And we could revisit those assumptions. Peanuts. We use ideal hours, right? But it could be, doesn't matter. Peanuts, just be consistent. Ideal hours work well for us because ultimately we needed to tie that back to actual effort. If you can't tie it back to actual effort, you cannot compute focus factor in hindsight. Here we have a change in scope. You see this GTM, that's a tag that we use to tag the baseline with, called go-to-market. That's what the GTM acronym means. So this, very simple, says, hey, we dropped a story, right? You know, John, be very concerned about that. Well, why isn't that feature important anymore? Or what part of that feature? Or maybe we split a feature into several stories. So this allowed us to focus on the change in a semi-automated way. Another element here, changing priorities. The priority change is important because ultimately when we built a sprint plan, it was based on priorities. So if your priority slipped from, well, this one went up, medium to high, good chance the highs get in. Sometimes the mediums don't. And finally, you know, here's our 5,614 story points, ideal hours in our world. It shrank by 14. So this was 14 points I owed John. And we aimed at our magic number of 5614. And it would vary a little bit. But you know, with a team of 20 developers, adding 10 hours of scope is not a big deal. That's half a day. So I wasn't worried about an exact match. I was just worried about a trend, right, of this number getting bigger and bigger. So, credible estimates. So we talked a little bit about estimates and the need for consistent estimates. We had one person do the estimates with input from other people, but ultimately one person, our architect, our software architect, made the decision, was that an 8-hour story, 20-hour, or 40? That way we had consistency. And it really didn't matter if he was off by 50%, as long as he was consistently off by 50%. Okay?
And I was not, by the way.
No, in fact, when we calibrated, we did a sort of a snapshot, did some planning poker. Well, I'll talk about that. I'll get to that point. Here we go. We played planning poker. How convenient. I'm sure we're familiar with that concept. We did a cross-section of our baseline because we had just too much to do. And we used that to calibrate our estimates. Say, do we make any big mistakes? We used phase, project phase. That's a timing indicator because we needed to have a staff profile that could execute it in that time. Okay, we used the user base size, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. Complexity, obviously complexity is a factor. And effort, how big is it? So we did a we went through a cross-section of our backlog, played planning poker, then used that to calibrate the rest of the estimates in the baseline. That was a one-off task, so I could get comfortable that we actually understood and had a reasonably calibrated backlog. Now the trick is, always plan against the raw estimate. Okay, when you do your burdening of estimates, you say, okay, there's some risk factor, complexity factor. That 8-hour story really is 16 hours, we think. When you hand it to the developer, don't hand him 16 hours, because you know what he's going to do. He's going to spend 18, right? Hand him 8. He'll probably spend 10. You're still below your 16.
You don't have any developer from your team in the room?
I have several. Put up your hands who's on my team here. 1, 2. Duncan's back there. So we have 3 developers here. We're an open team. They understand what's going on. But they recognize the same behaviors, right? So we need to burden our estimates. The 8 ideal hours, we could never, ever execute in 8 hours. We needed to burden it. And it's not just about development. So let's talk about it. So a full up burden, because my customer, John, wanted to know how many dollars for that feature, right? Forget ideal hours, what is all that? How much money is that feature costing me? Well, we had to factor in things like, management and support, the definition time, our BA team, architecture and design, development, obviously, fit for business, I'll talk a little bit more about, test and delivery, and potentially support and warranty if that's within your scope. So I just want to say a couple words about fit for business. It's the suitability of a product for use in the intended context. Now, you find contracts get written with all these nice requirements, and then there's one kicker at the bottom that says it shall be fit for use or fit for business. Completely untestable requirement. But we did recognize that the fit for business in this application, where there's tens of thousands of users, if it's a feature that tens of thousands of people are going to use, we're going to tune it a lot more than that feature that only 10 people, say the system administrators, are going to use. Because, the system administrators, we can buy them a beer and we can say, hey, it's okay, not so bad, this feature. 20,000 users can't do it, and ultimately that means market acceptance. So we spent a lot more effort tuning pieces of the application that had a large user base. And you have to account for that in your estimating. So FFB, or fit for business, is a very significant cost factor. We saw this when we looked retroactively, say, well, what are we doing here? Why are we spending so much time reworking these features? Just 2 extra clicks was a big deal. Because of the user community that we were in, it was a big deal. The community was changing. There was less experienced people in the market. It was kind of like something for dummies. And it used to be experts working a system without too much guidance except their knowledge. Now we have dummies using it, so we better not let them make mistakes. And so we derived a metric for fit for business that was largely based on user base, also to some degree based on complexity. So let's look at how we did this estimating. So each line here, this is a feature. Our planning poker said, well, this is when we need it, this is how complex it is, large user base, and there was our initial estimate, our calibrated initial estimate. So we would forecast a focus factor, and that took some time. Now, I should say one more thing about focus. The 70% rule, you might say, geez, you got a really unfocused team, 70%, isn't that awful? Well, no, because we chose, and you don't have to make this choice, but we chose to factor in the cost of technical coordination into the focus factor. That way I could relatively scale this from a team of 6 to a team of 30, because the amount of time for technical team leads was built in. Okay, and that was the primary reason why 70% worked for me. Otherwise, I think we'd need to be more around 90 or 95 or even 100. So we put our planning poker results in. Then we applied metrics. Really simple formulas. It's just a spreadsheet. It's using those numbers out of another table with some metrics to say, okay, well, if it has a large user base and it's complex, we think we're going to need an additional 4.8 hours to do this development. Remember that the fit for business component is not spent in the first sprint. When you develop it, you're not spending the fit for business. So don't hand that 4.8 hours to the first developer, because he's going to spend it, and guess what? You're still going to be tuning it. So this is spent in future sprints, but this allowed us to estimate many sprints over the course of time and understand, do we have a fence around the forest? System architect time. This is important in our world, to keep the architecture clean and pure. And bigger, more complex features required more input from our architecture team. You know, a bit of management and support to keep me employed.
What's the risk column?
The risk column was, this is based on this complexity. We're going to add some time to it because we know it's a complex one. And this is where we started to realize that a 40-hour story was not complex. As soon as we saw estimates like 160 hours, the complexity factor was always up because it really meant we don't understand it. That's what we learned. Then, of course, what you get at the end is a burdened estimate. This is in hours. You probably have an average daily rate for your people. You can turn that into dollars quite readily. So that allowed my customer to understand decisions he was making in terms of dollars, which is something he's very comfortable dealing with. So what else did we do? We refined the sprint model somewhat. We had a formalized set of activities leading up to the sprint. So I was talking a little bit about that earlier, where we had a milestone about 4 weeks before development to say initial scope's got to be here. And then about 2 weeks before, we said now a firm list and more detailed stories need to be here. So we published that and reviewed it very consistently. Because at any point in time in that model, there's 2 or 3 sprints going on. Okay, not the development part of the sprint, but you've got the story definition happening here at the same time as the sprint is executing for development, for the prior scope. So it gets complicated because they're overlapping. And we introduced a production sprint. The concept behind a production sprint, it's kind of a reverse sprint that's shorter. The concept is we don't do software first and then test at the end. We test first and then, yeah, everyone goes, oh, what's that? Test first? And then the reason is we don't, first of all, no stories in a production sprint. Okay, the idea is let's test. Let's find the problems when you got 27 people touching the code base and I want to release this out into the wild. I need some confidence the whole thing works. And that's why we did the test first, figured out our problems, and then made a little fix cycle, and then we were comfortable releasing it. It also allowed our customer to do a parallel test because we're one component of a bigger solution. So we could do a parallel test. We've released the prior sprint. They could test it with other parts of the system and feed back to us in time for us to do a couple fixes before everybody released a production version. And you'll see that clearly in this schedule. So this is a little snapshot of 3 of our sprints. There's the today line. And you'll see in sprint 28, we're in the middle of development. Well, not in the middle, say towards the start. We've got 80% of our team, they're doing development. On 29, our BA team is working furiously to get scope ready for the next one. And there's a good chance we were still up here delivering a production sprint. So we probably had a delivery just finishing, the start of the next development sprint going on, and the story development for the future sprint. And here's a production sprint. You'll see we do test first and then a fix and release. And they're very short, it's about 10 days.
Did you have any issues around the amount of fixes that you did in production?
Yes, it wasn't completely predictable. So we made some best guesses. We did a crossover plan at the production time to decide when can we release developers from the production test sprint into the next sprint. We'd use that to set up our capacity, and I'll go through the capacity model. That's where that comes out. Because it is a complex handover. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I can see very well. Estimation.
Can you speak up just a bit?
Estimation, story estimation, where is it in your schedule?
The estimation, it refines over time. So we would start
I'm talking about story estimation.
in here is when we are working in story development. It's not software development. This is story development. So in that period, we are refining the stories and refining the estimates. That's the last chance, if you will. Well, second last.
So, I'm not sure I'm following. Do you first define the scope and then you estimate the stories?
Both. We define the scope for several sets of sprints with a set of estimates. They're called initial estimates.
I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, that the people who do the scope definition, they're different than the ones who do the story estimates, is that right?
They work together, let's say. We have the story definition group, our BA team. They are working the story definition with our customer and with our architect, who is saying, well, if you're changing the story or refining it this way, it's going to get more expensive. Is that what you want to do? So that's an iterative process, and that the second last chance is here in story development.
So then first BA people, they define the scope and they define definition, they give definitions of stories.
They refine the story
and
definitions.
then you estimate them?
At the same time, it's happening at the same time. We don't go away and figure out our scope and then hand it all to the architect. They work together. So, you know, there may be 3 stories that 4 people are working today, and they'll work it. They'll go talk to the architect and say, okay, does this still fit in the initial estimate? Is really the question that always got asked. You know, I'm adding, I'm refining it, I'm making it more clear. Was this what you meant? And does it still work within your estimate? So we'd have a sort of a tension, if you will, between our architect and our BAs to keep it in the box.
So developers do not participate in estimation?
So that's why I said it was the second last chance, okay? The last chance is, it'll show up in the next slide a little more clearly. We talked about the production sprint. So let me get back to that, okay? It's on the next slide. So other refinements we made was that development sprints shouldn't be back-to-back. Okay, they were just, when they're back-to-back like that, you finish your development on sprint 28 and the next day you're starting 29. It just didn't work, right? It didn't work for us. So we added a 2-day team test event in between the two. The production sprint is the 5-day version of that. But 2-day team test, and there's some great dynamics in here. The team test meant developer A is testing developer B's software, okay? And there's lots of social dynamics around that because, you know, my colleague is testing my feature. So I won't submit a feature that I'm not proud of because I know he's going to kill me for it. And it's not my manager killing me for it because, you know, the manager's an idiot, right? But my peer over here knows what they're talking about and they're going to give me help for it. So there was really good social dynamics in there, and it really helped us drive up the quality of what went into the sprint.
Did you already have standards and guidelines for reviews of that?
Yes.
You already had them?
Yes. And we refined them, but yes, absolutely. And you'll see our Kanban board that sort of enforces that.
Excuse me, what's the length of the sprint?
Typically 4 weeks.
In this case, was 4 weeks, right?
Yeah, our typical sprint's 4.5 weeks. Production sprint, 2 weeks. We just found that worked for our team. I would support sprints from 2 weeks to about 6. I think when it gets longer than 6, you lose track of a target, and smaller than 2, there's just too much thrash.
So did you also have QA in the team, or was just developer testing developers?
So let's define QA first, okay? Because there's flavors of QA. I suspect you mean a testing team.
Correct.
Yeah? Okay, so yes, we have a dedicated test team. They're doing sell-offs throughout the sprint.
Did you do test-driven development?
Yes, absolutely. First thing, and this was always the joy, I see John smiling, right? Right, that's first. Yeah, I'll get to that. No. Now, write the test first. You have no other code but the test. They all fail. Now you're ready to start development. When they succeed, you're done. So absolutely, we're very firm on that aspect of it.
Automated testing?
Yes, yeah. Continuous integration runs multiple times a day. We have a lava lamp. When it goes green, it builds good. When it's red, it failed and someone's riding the scooter. Right? We have a scooter.
Videotape of the scooter if you went to see it.
Yeah. We have a scooter and a helmet with a flashing light, and if you broke the build, you're riding the scooter. Right? But, well, it's not one-sided, right? If the build didn't break for 2 weeks, I rode the scooter. Right? And if it was a month, Steve rode the scooter. Okay? So it was a two-way game, right? Okay, so keep going here. The other thing that was really it was a really great side effect of the team test event, is during that 2 days, the whole development machine was the responsibility of our QA team, okay? So now the senior group of technical people on the team had a few days that they could plan without having to think about a development sprint in progress. They could focus on the new, it was a critical handoff from the BA and the BA team and our architect to say, this is what we're trying to build with a team of, like I said, 27. There needed to be a transition of knowledge, and this 2-day was the perfect interval for this. And you'll see that in this little snippet. Here's our development sprint. When it finishes, we have a 2-day team test event. So at this time, we have planning going on. We start it toward the end of the sprint. The team leads will disengage a bit because it's mostly sell-off and resell-off and final fixing, so the team leads weren't too busy. We'd start our planning here, then we'd have 2 days of focused planning to let the architect and the BAs communicate effectively what it is they were trying to build next sprint. So the small group of technical leads had the vision, the concept of the architecture that was required for those features, and they could then effectively get the team moving the next day. But they didn't have to think about the team for 2 days, and that was a huge relief for our developers. Okay. Team capacity. Well, it's not simple. Okay, it's not team members time days in the week. It never worked for us that way. There's all kinds of other things that goes with, using humans in a team. So let me talk a little bit about it. Simple spreadsheet, no magic here. This is our sprint. Remember, we have very formalized sprint boundaries. We knew day 1 of the sprint, we knew the last day, because we had mapped it out in a calendar. So we knew precisely how many calendar days we had. Then we'd take each person and say, well, how available are they? Some people were only half-time on the project, so I couldn't count them as a full FTE. People take holidays. We had a production cycle overlap. 27P was still going on, so we had a group of people who would be involved in 27P at the start of 28. The P, by the way, is the indication that's a production cycle. We had ramp-up time. This was during a big growth period, so we couldn't count them as full-time people yet in terms of contributing to the team. It wouldn't be fair. On day 1, you're not productive. And so we ended up with capacity. How many calendar developer days do we have to apply to the... And then you say, okay, I have a focus factor. And now you apply the simple formula. There's your capacity. There's what I'm planning focus. That says we can execute 276 ideal days in this sprint. Very simple math at the end. There's nothing magic about it.
How about the expertise in the team? For example, certain people have an expertise on frameworks, these frameworks, and some people are junior developers. And how do you...
That's a factor. Let's see if I can pull out an example. Here, we had a new fellow join, relatively junior, so we didn't count them at full capacity because it wouldn't be fair. Did we have a spread of people? You're not seeing the full team here. We have a DBA on staff and a UI expert who would get some of the work, but we couldn't count them as a full FTE in development, or they'd get assigned a whole story, right, which they couldn't do. So yes, there was definitely a mix of skills.
Is your full capacity 5?
Sorry?
Full capacity per person 5?
5, I'm not sure. Where are you seeing 5?
5 days.
5 days a week.
Oh, 5 days a week. Sorry, this is a week. These are days, so yes, a full week is 5. Unless, of course, there was a stat holiday, which you'd model in there as well to say, well, this week doesn't have as many. Okay? And then at the end, we have actual focus factor, right? And this is where you know the ideal days you've delivered because you know what features you delivered. They all had an initial estimate. That estimate never changed. We also use a timesheet system, so I was able to collect the timesheet actuals to say, well, how did we do? Go, geez, 62%, we thought we'd do 70, right? We're a little under. So you use that and go, okay, why? What's the situation the team is in? How can you forecast better?
I heard you say that if that person
I think it was UI expert, had
Mhm.
more time, they might be assigned a story. Look, do
No, they
you
wouldn't be.
assign stories to individual people in the team, or did you take those stories and decompose them into tasks, and then people just grab the tasks and do the tasks?
Yes on both.
Okay.
Typically what we do is a developer is assigned to be the owner of a story.
I see.
If there's a complex UI piece, they would, and they're all tasked out to follow our development process. You know, you do unit test first, so they would task that out in target process, okay? So they could follow it. Then if there was complex UI, that task would be assigned to the UI developer, and they could see in their things to do list, here's all the tasks that the team has assigned me, and if it was too much, we'd say, okay, we have a bit of a problem, right? But at least we knew about it before it exploded in our face.
So I assume that the dependencies were factored in during the iteration planning, so people
Yes.
will continue to be productive and not be waiting on stuff to happen.
Yeah, I mean, typically we would have, you know, with say 18 developers, there was one database person and one UI person. Okay, the rest were, you could say, equal opportunity developers, interchangeable. If you have a complex mix of specialized skills, this is going to be a little harder to manage.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. Thank you.
You baseline this every sprint, right?
Sorry?
You baseline this every sprint.
Every sprint. Every sprint we do a forecast, and every sprint we do an actual. And it's usually part of the retrospective where we say to the team, this is how well we did. And I show them the same graph that I showed earlier. Here's our focus factor graph. Okay, committing. So we commit scope based on our forecast focus factor with those two lines. Remember I said there was the committed versus the planned. So we would put two estimates in place, and that would draw the line. It's a prioritized list. When you multiply your focus, your two different focuses against your capacity, you get 2 points in the list. Divides it into 3 groups: the in, the maybe, and the out. Right? Simple as that. Right? So this is what our sprint plan looked like. We use the same little tool. It's not complex math. So this is showing the crossover point. So we have prioritized. We happen to be looking at a slice of mediums. We have a mix of story and issues that are prioritized against each other. And anything above here is in. We're committing that. Stuff in here is a maybe. We hope to get to that. The stuff here, very little chance of us getting to it this sprint. So that let us set high targets for the team, slightly lower target with our customer. We always ended up in the middle somewhere, so we were always over-delivering from our customer's perspective. So we've gone through. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide so we have a few minutes at the end. So here's our Kanban. It's a real board. It's a whiteboard. I'm not a fan of an electronic version of this at all. This is used daily at our Scrum. The reason why I like the wall is because it gets our typically very introverted engineers all standing up and talking to each other and making commitments to each other, more importantly. Our little yellow stickies had a name and a date. And if you changed the date, you had to walk up to the board and pull it off, erase the date, or actually not erase it, strike it through and write a new one. So you were now in a position where in front of your peers you're making commitments. And I'm telling you, there is nothing more powerful than making commitments to a group of people that you respect. We added a few columns here to enforce our best practices. For example, we found that in the early sprints, the stuff that came out at the end wasn't quite the quality we wanted. We missed some design elements. That we had junior team members didn't understand the architecture, didn't understand the layering. So we added a design review column. And our architect could decide at his discretion, does this story need a design review or not? Same with the UI. The development phase we broke into 3 because we found that's the biggest piece. I don't want to just see it in development because it makes me nervous if it's not moving. So we said, you know, you're 25% through, you're 50% through, you're 75% through, and it moved. Awaiting sell-off, failed, and resell-off, they're all at the end, right? And this is a great thing for me to just walk by and understand where the bottlenecks are. I can walk by, I can see where we are in the sprint, and the team can self-manage here. If we find there's a big list of stickies here in the sell-off, we'd say, wait, we've got a test team bottleneck. Let's take some developers and let's add them to the test team for a day or two to clear that bottleneck. I'm a huge fan of the actual board as opposed to an electronic board. Yes? Sorry? John, you may want to answer that. Were there any trends coming out of the design review?
Yeah, we learned how to write better stories. The design review went down when we got the stories better, is what really happened. Because the developers understood what they had to build and why. And so we learned to write better test cases and stories up front to avoid, a lot of the design review went away when we did that. So we learned how to do that.
And as our team got more mature and had been in the domain for a while, they now understood the architecture principles that were in place, and they didn't need to be reviewed quite as much. Okay, so how do we bring this all together? Well, the first thing, start tracking your actual focus factor. I can't say enough how important that is. If you don't have some hard data on your actual focus, you're wasting your time. So which means you need actuals in some form or another, right? And I know a lot of developers, oh, I don't want to do a timesheet. There's a huge upside to doing a timesheet here because you're tracking overtime and excessive hours. This is a way to manage that away, because people don't want the overtime and excessive hours. But if you don't know it's being spent, I just think you're really productive, right? So that's the first thing. Get a scope baseline. Initial estimates against your scope. Agree with your customer on what the baseline is and refine your initial estimates. Establish the budget baseline, the start date, and the production release target dates. That's the fixing of the schedule that I talked about earlier. Add behavior detail to your story. That's the story refinement process. Plan your capacity model for each sprint. You can do that at a course level quite readily. Estimate the focus factors. You've got some data behind you, so if your team is reasonably consistent, you can, and even if it isn't, if it's predictably inconsistent, you can estimate a lower focus factor based on the fact you know there's change coming. Now, you have a scope, schedule, and budget. The trick is, keep the baseline balanced, right? And that's where your customer has to be playing a good role in this exercise. They've got to be bought into the process of keeping that budget, the scope baseline balanced. And that's it. I'd like to, before we go to general question, I just want to thank my customer, John, for showing up here. It's really appreciated to have a customer here, so thank you. Okay, any questions?
Could you just move the slide back over?
Did you finish the answer off for the estimating software development estimate?
Did I? Did we close on an answer to you? Okay, well, let's have a chat.